Are you trying to figure out how to get money penalty-free out of your IRA or 401k before age 59 and a half? Well, if so, stay tuned to this week's episode of the Retirement Income Source, where it's all about the income. Welcome to Retirement Income Source, where it's all about the income. I'm David Scranton, here with my good friend and co-host, Sarah Samuels. And today, we are talking about 401ks. You know, we always talk about why people want to roll those 401ks over to IRAs, generally at age 59 and a half, and that's still valid in most cases. But the question becomes, in which cases do you want to leave the money there, and in which cases, or how perhaps, can you get that money out penalty-free if you need it earlier?
Dave, it's great to be here with you, of course, and with all of our listeners as we tackle this important topic, because a lot of people out there might be wondering, hey, what are these exceptions? What do I need to know about if I want to take money out of my 401k and IRA? So it's great to be here with you, of course.
Well, great to be here. Too great to have you here. Absolutely.
How's your week been? You've had a nice week so far?
Yeah, so far so good. I had, I hope my family's not listening, but we had about 2 weeks of back-to-back visitors, family members coming. One side of the family and the other side of the family. So you know how that is. It's fun to see everyone, but also you're trying to fit it in along with your regular work you have to do. So it's kind of nice now to just kind of be back to normal for a few days.
Yeah. What's it saying about a cheese and out-of-town visitors? They both start to stink after 3 days.
I never heard that, but I might use it.
I think that's a saying.
That's
Maybe
awesome.
I just made that up. I'm not sure. But more importantly, Dave, let's talk about these exceptions for taking money out of your 401k. First of all, what are the reasons why people might want to roll over their 401k typically when they reach the age 59 and a half?
Yeah, we assume that people want to leave their money in the 401k until they turn 59 and a half. But as we see today, there's lots of reasons why people may not want to. But to answer your question, to me, it's simple. It's that 401ks are plans designed to attract and to retain key employees. And who are they attracting generally? People in their 60s or people in their 20s, 30s, and 40s?
Right. We don't want to sound ageist, but typically companies are looking for maybe employees that are more on the younger side because they're growing. They're in their early career phase. They want to be in the workforce for many years.
And they set up these benefits plans to appeal to those folks, which means there's a lot of growth-based options oftentimes in 401ks, but there are very few good income-based options. Like Sarah, we always talk about in the show, how if you're an advisor or you're a true income specialist, well, then you're not using bond mutual funds or bond ETFs as a general rule. You're using individual bonds and bond-like instruments, right?
Right. Well,
Those things simply aren't available in most 401ks. So again, 401ks are designed for those accumulation years. And the problem is, yes, you can in most cases do in-service rollovers. You can roll the money over to an IRA after you're 59 and a half with most companies. But frankly, for many who want to retire in their mid-60s, that's not soon enough. Because people retiring in their mid-60s should probably be rolling it over in their early to mid-50s, not 59 and a half.
Right, and that's hitting that red zone we always talk about, right? That 5 to 10 years out from retirement when you need to be making that transition. Or more. Anyway, let's get into our Ask Dave questions. So we have Jerry from Ohio. He sent us an email. He said, I understand that you can borrow against your 401k, but is that really a good idea?
All right, Jerry. Well, good question, and glad to have you here as a regular listener writing into us. So the answer is it depends, right? It really does depend. Most of the time, it's not ideal because it sounds good. So let's put in perspective for those of you who are not familiar with borrowing against 401ks. Usually, you can borrow up to half your 401k balance to a maximum of $50,000. Okay, so the appeal to it on paper is that you're paying interest, but you're paying interest back to yourself. It's going into your own account. So essentially, it's not costing you anything. So what are the problems with that? Well, first of all, if you take a 5-year payback on $50,000, those payments are $1,000 a month. So those payments are made with after-tax dollars. They come right out of your take-home check, Jerry. So that can be a little tight for some people because you can't stretch it out longer than that. That's one issue. The other issue is that the interest isn't deductible. So you're putting after-tax interest non-deductible interest into the plan. But guess what? When you go to take that money out down the road, it's taxed again. So, you're paying with after-tax dollars, but you have to pay tax a second time. And that's a problem. And sometimes, Jerry, the third and perhaps the biggest issue is it's not about what you're paying yourself and what you're supposedly earning because you're paying interest to yourself. It's more about your lost opportunity cost. In other words, what are you losing in possible interest or gains by not being invested in the sub-accounts? Because, Jerry, when you're not in those, when you're taking a loan against it and you're paying yourself back, the loan is the asset. You're not in those sub-accounts. Now, you might get lucky. You might take a loan during a 5-year period where the market drops by 50%. Well, heck, then that was the best idea in the world because you protected yourself from the losses. But over most 5-year periods, the market goes up, which means that what your real cost of taking that loan is whatever the market would have averaged over the course of 5 years. So traditionally, I recommend you look at every and any other opportunity first to access capital. But if you're really stuck and you can't get it anywhere else, you can't borrow it anywhere else, then the 401k is a lender of last resort.
And Jerry, thank you so much for sending in your Ask Dave question. And if any of our listeners have a question maybe about your retirement plan or your 401k that you would like to write in to Ask Dave, all you have to do is send us an email to askdave@retirementincomesource. That's SOURCE.com. You're listening to the Retirement Income Source, where it's all about the income. I'm Sarah Samuels here with David Scranton, and we are talking about ways that you can actually, when you can actually take withdrawals from your 401ks and your IRAs. So we're talking about the exceptions to the rule and when you can take money out. And Dave, you just answered a really good question from a listener, Jerry. Thank you for writing in, who was asking, is it ever a good idea to borrow against your 401k? And you explained several reasons why it should be a last resort option.
It's a lender of last resort is how I like to say it. Absolutely. Yeah. It's like you go for a hard money loan. Well, that's a lender of last resort, right? You might get Vito coming after you with a hammer. So you got to be careful. But this is a lender of last resort in a different way. Not to mention the fact that if you leave your company or you get laid off, then you have to pay that back in a lump sum. Usually that doesn't carry over to the next employer, so it gets really tricky.
Wow, so that's if you take money out from your 401k, you have to pay back in a lump sum to that employer.
That's if you're borrowing.
If you're
take
borrowing
a loan and there's an unpaid balance when you
and you leave or get laid off, you have to pay it back. Wow.
That's right. And sometimes they let you keep it there, and sometimes they'll let you continue to make the payments. Yeah. But let's say you got laid off. Now, how are you going to be able to afford to make your payments, right? Unemployment benefits are less than what you were earning, so most people can't afford to pay it back. So now that unpaid loan balance essentially gets converted to a withdrawal. And if you're under age 59 and a half, that means that you're going to have a penalty. You're going to have a 59.5%, 10% penalty for under 59 and a half, and pay all the taxes.
Yeah. Well, let's talk more about those penalties. So if you take money out of your accounts and you're under age 59 and a half, you are going to be facing that 10% penalty, right? Plus paying federal income tax, potentially state tax.
Correct. The 10% penalty. Yeah. But also, so what are the exceptions, right? Mm-hmm. That's what we're talking about today, really. What are some of the exceptions whereby we can pull money out penalty-free before 59 and a half? Well, just to name a few, disability is one where you can pull money out before 59 and a half. Another one, which is applicable for IRAs, not 401ks, is if you're a first-time home buyer, that applies, or if you're paying for higher education. Again, it's good for IRAs, not 401ks. If you're disabled, it's good for both. If you have financial hardship, it's good for both, but you've got to be careful. Financial hardship is not, may not be what you think. Financial hardship is you've long since defaulted on a loan, you're about to get foreclosed on, and you have to make those payments to keep your house or something that's important to you like that. Also, there's penalty-free ways to access it potentially after age 55 instead of 59 and a half, and also even before age 55 if you follow what's called Section 72T of the IRS code, which we're going to be talking about later on the show. I'm David Scranton here with Sarah Samuels, and this is the Retirement Income Source, where it's all about the income.
Welcome back to the Retirement Income Source, where it's all about the income. I'm Sarah Samuels here with David Scranton. And if you've ever wondered if you can take some money out of your 401k or your IRA, or if you actually qualify for all of these different exceptions related to that, well, today is a show for you because we are talking about the different exceptions to the penalty rule if you need to take money out of those accounts. So, Dave, we talked a little bit about how disability is an exception, how there's some military exceptions. But let's talk more about what qualifies you if you are facing a disability, if you're able to take money from your account.
It's more restrictive than a lot of people think because generally it follows the Social Security disability rules. And Social Security disability is hard to get. If somebody has private disability insurance, many times they will have payments from the disability insurance who declares them disabled before Social Security kicks in. So it depends in part about how the plan document is written, what the definitions are. And sometimes it can be tied to a group disability plan, but a lot of times it's tied to Social Security. And Social Security has a nasty habit of declining everyone virtually the first time they apply. And you have to get an attorney, you have to go back in, you have to apply for an exception, and eventually you might get it. But that's the trigger for many plans, unfortunately.
Yep. Now, what about when it comes to the military? Because I know that you mentioned there was an exception that has to do if you are in the military.
Yeah, so if you're a reservist, and
Yep.
this is pretty neat, if you're a reservist and you get called up to active duty, then yes, you can take money out penalty-free from your IRA and your 401k, either one. So this is one of those things that's for IRAs and 401ks, just like disability. We mentioned financial hardship, right? Financial hardship is an issue because, again, you can't have just, oh gosh, I might be 30 days late on a credit card. I mean, it has to be significant hardship. Usually it's defaulting on a home or something like that. The one thing that's interesting that applies to both 401ks and IRAs is if you have an IRS levy. So it's interesting, Sarah, that if you want to use the money for higher education, it only applies to IRAs, but not 401ks. If you're a first-time home buyer, it only applies to IRAs, not 401ks. But when it comes to the IRS getting their money, Sarah, and there's an IRS lien on a taxpayer, guess what? How nice of them to let you take that money out penalty-free from that 401k to pay that tax bill, to fix that tax levy.
Oh, that doesn't surprise me at all. Uncle Sam wants to get paid. So, hey, you need to borrow against this to pay us?
Not even borrow, just withdrawal. So now they get paid twice.
Oh, right.
They're
That's
getting the
when
money
they
out
pay
to
the
pay the
penalty.
tax money, and then the following year you owe taxes on what you withdrew. So it's kind of funny how some of these rules are written.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. Well, you mentioned another type of distribution. That actually has to do with our next Ask Dave question. We have Jane from Tennessee. She says, Dave, I heard you mention 72T distributions. What are those?
All right, Jane. Well, first of all, my first piece of advice is don't try this at home. Make sure you work with an accountant or a qualified financial advisor to help you put together 72T distributions. So what are they? Basically, it's an area of the IRS code that creates an exception for the 10% penalty. It says if you're under age 59 and a half and you need to take withdrawals on a regular basis, you could take what's called substantially equal payments. Substantially equal payments. What does that mean? That means that you really are using this for income. You want income early. You don't have to be retired to do this. You could be, but you don't have to be. But you're taking it as a form of income. Because remember, that's what they want. This 401k, the IRA, is for income. You're not using it for a lump sum. Now, that sounds good, but here's where it gets a little sticky. The substantially equal payments have 3 different approved IRS formulas, and that's it. And it's based upon, their rigid formulas, and one formula pays less, another formula pays more, and a third formula pays a bit more. But you pretty much have to stick to one of these 3 formulas. And at the same time, you have to continue to take those substantially equal payments based upon that IRS formula to the ladder of, now get this, Jane, to the ladder of 5 years or age 59 and a half. So, Jane, if you're 52, then you've got to take those for 7.5 years. If you're 58, like I am, well, then you have to take them for 5 years. So again, it's very inflexible, but it's because the IRS wants to make sure you're taking these payments essentially in substantially equal payment form as income. And now there is a little bit of flexibility. It's not quite as rigid as I mentioned for one reason. When you set up the plan, it's possible in many cases to carve your IRA into 2 IRAs so that you figure out how much income you really want, how much money you need in a particular IRA based upon one of the IRS formulas to generate that income, and split the IRA into 2. Carve that first one out, calculate the 72T income amount based upon that, and then leave the other one in reserve. But again, for the one you've invoked, you have to take those payments for the latter of 5 years, or you're attaining age 59 and a half.
And Jane, I hope that helps answer your question, and we appreciate you listening to the show and sending in your question for Dave to answer. If any of our listeners out there or even our YouTube viewers have a question that you would like to ask Dave, all you have to do is email us at askdave@retirementincomesource.com. You're listening to the Retirement Income Source, where it's all about the income. I'm Sarah Samuels here with David Scranton, and we are talking about the times when you can take a withdrawal from your 401k or your IRA without a penalty. So we've talked about specifically times that you can take a withdrawal from both without penalty, both 401k and IRA. Dave, you mentioned if you are disabled, if you get Social Security disability, then that's one way to qualify. If you are a reservist, active duty, you're able to qualify using that exception. But there are some rules that only apply to either 401k or IRA, right?
Right. So 401ks are a little bit more restrictive in recent years. Now, that wasn't the way. You know, when I was studying for my CFP, you couldn't.
Many years ago.
Hey, easy there with the many. One many would have been fine in that statement, Sarah, just in case you
I just want our listeners
many
to know.
years ago, not many, but the reality is that before, to take money out of the IRA penalty-free, you know, it really, for the most part, had to be 72T. It had to be level distributions. But now they've thrown more things on there. So it's nice that, you know, if you have IRA money, let's say you switched employers, you've rolled it over to an IRA, which, by the way, is one of the reasons why if you switch employers in your 30s or 40s, you probably want to roll it to an IRA because now you have more flexibility there, right? Not just with investments, but also if you want to take that money for higher education for yourself or you know, as a first-time home buyer or things like that.
Yeah, because that's one of the only times really that you can roll it over a typical time, right? If you change employers and you can make a decision at that point with the
That's right.
rollover.
And we didn't mention that, but that's true. Whenever you do leave an employer, you have an option. You can leave it at your old employer and let it sit there, or you can roll it over to an IRA, which typically gives you the most flexibility. But if you like the 401k of your new company and the options in it, then a lot of companies do allow rollovers into that 401k from an old 401k. So you can do that. But again, if you do that, then you know those extra things like being able to pay for a first-time home with that money, or for higher education, those things are now off the table.
So do you think that's really a good idea, Dave? Should someone, you know, just a general case, should they take that money and roll it over into an IRA and maybe potentially start a new 401k with the company, or should they try to roll over that old 401k into the new one?
Most of the time, it's better to go to an IRA simply because you have a little bit more flexibility. And there is one exception that we're going to talk about in a moment. Maybe we can get to this even in the next segment of the show. And it's really for people who retire at age 55, you know, who are leaving an employer at age 55. I mentioned that at the top of the show, where you have an exception there. So that's something that we need to spend a little time on. But beside that, most people want to go to the IRA because there's more flexibility with some of the things we've talked about, but especially more flexibility with just how you can invest your money. You're not limited to a handful of options in a 401k.
Right, and we talk a lot about how 401ks are really growth options. They have a lot of growth options, and they're more for younger people earlier in their careers. They don't have a lot of great income options for people at or near retirement.
That's right. There's very few good income options in these 401ks. It's, you know, you'll see most of the time, Sarah, if you have 15 funds, you have 12 stock funds of various flavors, and as we always talk about in the show, there's lots of reasons why stock funds don't pay high dividends, because they're trying to compete against the S&P 500, which has a dividend yield of under 1.5%. So therefore, you know, you're not going to get a stock fund with a 3 or 4% dividend typically in a 401k. And then if you get 12 of those, you might have 2 bond funds, right? And for our regular listeners, you know why bond funds aren't the best option in the income world. And then you might have 1 fixed interest fund, which today might be paying 4 or 5%, which isn't bad, but for most of the last 15 years, it might have been paying 1%.
Absolutely. Well, if you are in that magic age that Dave mentioned between 55 and 59 and a half, and you've decided to retire at 55, there is an exception for you, but you need to know the rules surrounding it. I'm Sarah Samuels here with David Scranton, and you're listening to the Retirement Income Source, where it's all about the income. You're listening to the Retirement Income Source, where it's all about the income. I'm Sarah Samuels here with David Scranton, and we are talking about all the exceptions to the rule of when you can withdraw money from your 401k or even your IRA. So we've talked about the different exceptions that actually affect both types of accounts, including a disability exception, a qualified reservist, active duty exception. We've also talked about if you have a financial hardship, what that can do. But Dave, you mentioned a few moments ago that there's this magical 4.5-year age range, right? 55 to 59 and a half, where something happens if you retire or even maybe lose your job, get laid off around age 55 or in that range, there's an exception for those people as well.
That's right. And it's interesting because many financial advisors, Sarah, don't talk about that. Because if somebody retires or leaves their company at 55 or 57 or 58, all of a sudden, well, gosh, the financial advisor has to wait a few years before they can roll it over to an IRA and take that money. So advisors don't really want to talk about that, but it does give penalty-free access to people once they leave the company for whatever reason, and they're over the age of 55, where they can access that money. They still have to pay income taxes, but they don't have to pay the penalty. And this is such a big deal that now a lot of the regulations have come out where you actually, before you can roll that 401k over to an IRA, you have to have a disclosure. You have to read a disclosure, and often on a recorded line say, I understand, because the disclosure, it tells lots of different things, but the biggest thing in the disclosure is really about, hey, do you realize that if you're not age 59 and a half, you may be tying your money up till you're 59 and a half, or at least, making it susceptible to penalties. Yeah. Whereas if you leave it in the 401k, you have access at age 55.
Why is it at that age 55? Is it typically people used to retire around that age, or where did they come up with that number? Since we have 59 and a half is to do the rollover.
That's right. I don't know, and the reality is, how things get pushed through Congress. Yeah. Right.
Or they don't.
Yeah. That's right.
Alternatively.
That's right. You work for a politically oriented television station in the past, so you know how that goes. Mm-hmm. When they're making the sausage in Congress, it's a big negotiation, and they throw things in to get it approved that maybe somebody doesn't want, but they tag a bill onto another bill, and they come up with these ages, and it's all compromise. So somebody may have said, well, 59 and a half doesn't do us any good because you can take it penalty free anyway. Well, we want age 50. Well, no, age 50 is too young,
Right. The typical back and forth.
Yeah, so it's back and forth. And finally, someone compromises at age 55. So better than to think that things that come out of Congress necessarily have to make sense.
Right, or that it's based on a rational thought.
That's
exactly.
Right. That's
all right. Well, let's get to our next Ask Dave question, because this actually has to do with someone who is unfortunately in that age range, that 4.5-year age range. So we have Alan from Wisconsin. He says, I'm 57 and I got laid off about a month ago. Should I leave my money in the 401k even though there are not great income options, or should I roll it over to the IRA to do 72T distributions?
All right, Alan, I see your dilemma here. You're right that if you leave it in the 401k for the next 2.5 years, you're probably the money's susceptible to probably additional risk and certainly not generating a lot of income. So whatever you withdraw from that 401k between 57 and 59 and a half is likely to come out of principal. So I get that. On the other hand, you can go into an IRA, invest the right way for income, and if you're a regular listener to our show, you know what that's all about, right? And then take 72T distributions. Of course, the problem is you've got to keep those distributions level until you're age 62. So here's what I recommend, Alan. Go to Human Resources and check into your plan. Some plans allow partial rollovers. Now, some, it's got to be all or nothing, but some allow partial rollovers. And what I've done in many cases is to ask somebody like yourself, how much income do you think you're going to want to take in the next 2.5 years? So let's say you tell me $40,000 a year. That in unemployment, and I'm going to be okay. So that means I want to leave $100,000 in that 401k, Alan, to help support you between age 57 and 59 and a half. I might put it in a fixed interest fund so it's safe because we have a short-term horizon on that. In fact, I might even leave 125, 150 in there, a little bit more. Then roll the rest over to an IRA. And that way there you can invest in the universe of income generating options, the things that we talk about often week in and week out right here on the Retirement Income Source. And that way there you get the best of all worlds. You get the cash flow that you want for the next 2.5 years. You get the investments that you want. You can make that transition from being total return based, regardless of where it comes from, to an income first, growth second philosophy in that IRA. And another very big benefit is now you're not stuck taking equal payments for 5 years. Because, Alan, think about it. What if you find a job 6 months into the 72T distributions? Now you're stuck taking those 72T distributions for 4.5 years while you're working. And that income is going to get stacked onto your earned income and probably push you in another tax bracket. So go ahead and check with Human Resources and find out if you can do a partial rollover. If you can, Alan, that will probably be your best solution.
And Alan, thank you so much for sending in your Ask Dave email. And if any of our listeners or our YouTube viewers out there have a question about retirement or maybe a 401k plan or an IRA that you would like to ask Dave, all you have to do is send us an email to askdave@retirementincomesource.com. Thank you for listening to the Retirement Income Source, where it's all about the income. I'm Sarah Samuels here with David Scranton. And of course, we always want you to keep as much income as possible. So today we're covering all of the different exceptions to the penalty rule when it comes to taking money out of your 401k or your IRA. So we talked about, Dave, all the different exceptions for both types of accounts. We mentioned disability, military exceptions, financial hardship exceptions. And we just talked about kind of an interesting rule where there's this 4.5-year age range if you lose your job or if you choose to retire at age 55, where you're kind of stuck in this gray zone. Like you're kind of on standby, and you might be like our last Ask Dave question, Alan, who isn't sure what to do because he's age 57 and he's kind of in a holding pattern.
Yeah, the partial rollover is really the salvation there. But if you can't do that because the employer doesn't allow, then it really depends. And generally speaking, the closer you are to 55, the more you might want to just leave it there so you have the access. And then if you get another job, you can roll it over subsequently. The closer you are to 59.5, the easier it is to make the decision to roll it over and try to scrape by. So it does depend. But I love this topic today, Sarah, because, we spoke just last week about, how to balance your money between before tax and after tax and everything. So last week we kind of talked about preventative maintenance, right? How to prevent this from happening. So if you get laid off or you have a financial hardship or whatever the thing is, you want to buy your first home or you want to send yourself back to school, you don't have to dip into the pre-tax money because you have some post-tax money sitting there. So we talked about that last week. Of course, 1 week is not enough time for our listeners to fix their situation and balance it out.
Right, absolutely.
So now we're doing the damage control show. Right now it's about, okay, if you didn't do that and you got a little lopsided toward the pre-tax, well, now, okay, this is how you might be able to fix it.
Yep. And I'm sure most of our or all of our listeners want to avoid paying any of these penalties because, Dave, you mentioned some of the downsides, which you can have a really large monthly payment if you're paying $50,000 back over 5 years. That's $1,000 a month payment, and that you're essentially paying double tax, right? Because you've already paid tax on the money that you withdraw. Now, when you pay it back, you got to pay tax again. So
you're paying it back with after tax interest. So because you're paying it back with after tax interest, but then when you pull that money out again the second time, guess what? As a withdrawal, that after-tax interest is now taxed again.
That's when you get dinged again, right? Exactly. So there's a lot of negatives to it. Really, it seems like it should be a last resort option to borrow against your 401k, even if you meet one of these exceptions.
And Sarah, withdrawing from your 401k with one of these exceptions is still a last resort because it's time value of money, and whatever you take out of that 401k isn't going to continue to grow and compound. It's not going to be there to generate income in retirement. So it's good to find any other way possible. So, for example, if you have a home with some equity in it, you could take a home equity loan, home equity line of credit, right? What I'm about to say may not be the best, but okay, what if you need some money? What if you can find a credit card at 0 or very low % interest? Maybe you could advance that. Maybe you can roll it over periodically to more low interest or 0 interest credit cards, right? You can find money creatively. Then if those payments get to be difficult, okay, then you can go to the lender of last resort or take a withdrawal of last resort from that 401k. Yeah. But, I want you as our listeners to really realize that is not the first place to go. After you've exhausted every other option, even loans from family members, let's say, then look at the 401k because the real cost of that withdrawal is not just the money you took out and the taxes. it is all the future growth on that money that would have been tax deferred that you've now sacrificed.
Yep. And that's really the most damaging part. Well, we're going to continue to discuss 401ks, IRAs, and the exception to the rule, plus some other options if you need to be able to generate income. I'm Sarah Samuels here with David Scranton, and you're listening to the Retirement Income Source, where it's all about the income.
Welcome back to the Retirement Income Source, where it's all about the income. I'm David Scranton, here with Sarah Samuels. And we always talk on the show about why most people roll 401k money over to IRAs as soon as they leave a company, or even if they're with the company but have turned that magical age of 59 and a half. But what if you need some of that 401k money before you turn age 59 and a half? Then what can you do? Well, if you're just joining us, that's what we're focusing on today. And so far, we've covered the ability to take loans from a 401k plan, which you can do for any reason at any age up to the prescribed limits in the plan. But we also discussed about the reasons you could take penalty-free withdrawals. So from 401ks, for example, disability, getting called back as a reservist into the military, and financial hardship. From IRAs, we talked about buying a first-time home. We talked about also higher education costs and things like that. So again, all the things that you can do. In fact, we even talked about 72T distributions from IRAs if you're under age 59 and a half, substantially equal payments. And also, if you leave an employer and you're over 55, how you could take money penalty-free from a 401k plan.
Dave, we talked about withdrawing money versus borrowing money against it. So if someone is actually able to use one of these exceptions we've been discussing today to withdraw the money, are they better off, or are they worse off than borrowing against the money?
Well, we talked a lot about how it's the lender and the withdrawer of last resort, right? So if you can get the money anywhere else, like we just talked about in the last block, certainly get it in that other place. But what if you can't, is the question, right? What if you're stuck and that's all you have? Well, if I had to choose, I would say the lending is better if you feel confident you can pay it back. And the reason for that's because, of course, the money eventually gets back in the plan. It gets reinvested as you repay it. And therefore, you're not hurting your retirement quite as much. When you take that withdrawal, you simply can't put it back in again. And you're paying the taxes, even if you can avoid the penalty. So if I were forced, I would say, assuming you could pay it back, then you're better off taking that loan.
All right. So we've talked about if you need to take a loan, if you are in the last resort situation. But what about the opposite end of the spectrum, right? When the government forces you to start taking those distributions, we call them required minimum distributions, and they kick in at age 73.
Yeah, imagine that, right? At certain ages, they don't allow you. How dare you take money out of your 401k or IRA? And then at certain ages, they kick you out with both feet.
Yeah, it's kind of like you said earlier, Dave. There's no rhyme or reason when it comes to the decision making.
Well, on the front end, they want you to make sure that you're using it for income purposes, that you're not getting tax benefits to buy, not putting money away and getting company matching so you can buy a house or something. It's for retirement. But on the back end, they want to make sure that, God forbid, you live to be 100 years old, that they get their tax
And you've
money.
never paid until then, right? That would be a big problem.
It's all pre-tax money. That's right. So your money went in pre-tax, your gains and your interest accumulated pre-tax. So now when it comes out, every dime is taxable. And that starts at age 70 and a half with about 4% of your money. So if you've got $100,000, that's $4,000 a year you have to take out and pay tax on it starting at age 73. And guess what? The percentage you have to take goes up each and every year afterward.
Yep. But just like withdrawing money, there are exceptions to every rule. And our next question comes from Jim out of Nevada. He says, Dave, I'm approaching age 73, but I am still working. So do I have to take my required minimum distribution?
All right, Jim. Well, today might be your lucky day. So the answer is a little complicated, but not too bad. So Jim, if you're not an owner of the company, so if you're just working as an employee, then in most cases you do not have to take your RMDs from that 401k. But you do have to take RMDs from your IRAs. You do have to take RMDs from other 401ks. So what does that mean to you? Well, that means that if you have other 401ks that you haven't rolled over to an IRA, maybe rolling those into your current 401k before you turn 73, it might be helpful. If you have some IRAs, we call them conduit IRAs, that have been rolled over from a 401k but haven't been mixed with any other money. It just came out of a 401k and is a standalone IRA. In many cases, that standalone IRA can be rolled back into that 401k also. Now, if it's been mixed with regular annual IRA contributions, well, then that option's off the table. So this is where, if your goal is to save tax, maybe getting a little bit money stuffed into that existing 401k, the current 401k, the company for which you're working, could save you those tax dollars because you don't have to take required minimum distributions. However, the opposite side of the argument is that you're at an age where at some point you're probably going to be retiring and you're going to want income. Maybe you're even working part-time right now. Maybe you're even supplementing the income from other sources. So you don't want to let the tax tail wag the investment dog. You still want to make sure that whatever you do, you've got the ability to invest with an income first, growth second philosophy. And unfortunately, that might just mean being stuck with IRAs instead of 401ks, which means that most of your accounts will still be subject to required minimum distributions.
Jim, I hope that helps answer your question. And thank you so much for sending us an email. If any of our listeners out there have a question that you would like to ask Dave, all you have to do is send us an email to askdave@retirementincomesource. That's SOURCE.com. Thank you for spending some time here with us today on the Retirement Income Source, where it's all about the income. I'm Sarah Samuels here with David Scranton, and we have been talking about some of the ways that you can actually withdraw money without incurring a penalty from your 401k or IRA. We've also talked about ways you can borrow money, but mostly, Dave, we've talked about how that's not really the best option. It is a borrower of last resort, if at all possible. Now, we talked about the other side of the spectrum too, right? With Jim, our friend in Nevada who's approaching age 73. He knows he has to take these required minimum distributions because he's hitting that magical age, but he's still working. So are there any other exceptions our listeners need to know when it comes to RMDs, or are they otherwise pretty much stuck paying that bill at that age?
You're stuck paying the bill.
Yeah.
If you start planning in your 60s where you want to start doing some Roth IRA conversions because they make sense, well, then on any money that's converted, you can you certainly reduce those RMDs in the future. But one thing is, a lot of people think they could take their actual RMD and roll that over to a Roth, and you can't, right? Because that RMD is being forced to come out. They want to get the taxes on it, so they will not let you roll that into a Roth IRA. Now, you can take out more than your RMD and roll the extra into a Roth IRA, but again, that all depends upon what tax bracket you're in when you're making the plan to do those Roth conversions.
Yep. And I know that RMDs can sometimes become a headache for those that don't plan for them ahead of time because of that tax time bomb you mentioned. If you're taking too much income, too many distributions, you can end up paying more in taxes than you were planning on.
Well, and that's true, but even the bigger headache or time bomb is if people haven't made that transition we always talk about in the show, from being growth focused to having an income first focus, because the government's forcing you to take these required minimum distributions. It's your decision to determine whether you want to take them from interest and dividends or allow the government to force you to take it out of principal. How do you do that? Well, by making sure that you're earning at least a 4% interest or dividend payment. Because if you're not, you're selling shares. So think about this. You turn 73. Sarah, I know it's a long way away for you, but you're getting a 2% dividend, and you have to take out 4%. So the other 2%, the additional 2%, has to come out of your what?
Well, interest and dividends.
The first does. But where's the rest of it come from? From principal.
Yeah.
So now you turn 90, right? So for 17 years you've taken RMDs times 2%. That's 34% has come out of principal. But it's even worse because the percentage goes up. So by the time you're 90, you've probably taken 50% of the money out of your principal. Yeah. And if the market's done really, really, really well at the end of the 90s, maybe that's okay. It grew back. Yeah. But oftentimes it doesn't. Now, you might be thinking, well, who cares by the time I'm 90? Do I really care? Well, I've got news for you. When you turn 90, you will care.
And people are living longer than ever before, and they're staying healthy into a really old age. I'm lucky to have both of my grandparents, and they're in their 90s, and they're still doing okay, knock on wood. So you want to have that money to be able to have options in your 90s. And Dave, you mentioned, too, that if you've been investing for income the entire time and you need to actually withdraw some of your principal when you reach your 80s and 90s for healthcare, that's always a great inflation hedge against healthcare inflation.
That's fine when you get into your mid-late 80s or later. Yeah. But again, you have to have the money there. If you've spent down half the principal because you've let the government force you to take RMDs out of principal, well, then it simply doesn't work. And that's why it's so important to focus on your investment strategies, certainly at that time, if not sooner.
Yep. And if you are wondering, hey, where can I talk to someone that specializes in these income strategies? All you need to do is visit our website. It's retirementincomesource.com. You can actually check out our interactive map there to find someone in your area. And lots of our advisors service all over the entire country. So I highly recommend that you find and work with an income specialist if you're at that age range, 5 to 10 years before retirement.
Absolutely. And most important, we hope that you're here to join us next week. Same time, same station. I'm David Scranton here with Sarah Samuels, and this is the Retirement Income Source, where it's all about the income.